Carmen here, managing digital editor at Ms. with Aishah Shahidah Simmons, who you have so many, you do so much that I don't even know how to properly introduce you. Writer, filmmaker, activist, lecturer, all around badass. But really, I knew when I was reading about the work that you had done, and when you reached out to me, I saw that line of sort of storytelling as activism and storytelling as an agent of change. And I mean, I'm obviously very drawn to that too, as someone who's a writer and a journalist. So yeah, I mean, you made this documentary film in 2006, right?
Yes.
No, the documentary, and you're now publishing this anthology,
Yes.
Love with Accountability.
Yes.
And and so as a storyteller, what do you think are some of the most, this is such a powerful moment for storytelling too, with Me Too swirling around, and we've actually seen the ways in which, right, like telling our own stories can actually cause some kind of sea change.
Definitely.
And like, as a storyteller, what do you feel the power of storytelling really can be in affecting the kind of change we need in the movement to end sexual violence?
Yeah, my experience with storytelling is that it is groundbreaking. That people, they need something to catch on to, right? And then oftentimes it transcends so much that we can, particularly unfortunately around sexual violence, we'll hear stories that are similar to ours, that affirm our existence. Because so often with sexual violence, I am a child sexual abuse survivor, I'm an adult rape survivor, we blame ourselves. And so then when we hear other people tell their stories that are similar or parallel or different, then we go, oh, it's not just me. That's the really key, that I'm not alone. And we also, so we're part of that community of like folks who are breaking silences. And then we also see like, oh, they're able to tell their story. They're getting the support they need. Maybe I need to get some.
Yeah. Well, and your documentary came out before we even really saw the Title IX changes that unfolded, that helped survivors sort of get a little closer to justice. And this anthology is about child sexual abuse, which is something that even in the Me Too movement, I know that survivors have been frustrated to see is still a topic that sort of is relegated to the shadows, is not at the center or the forefront all the time of the fight. And how do you feel that the movement can do a better job at honoring the stories of folks who are survivors and who are specifically, child sex abuse survivors? How do we make sure when we tell the story of this movement that we're telling everyone's stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, Me Too movement has become a catch-all for so much. And when I think about sister survivor, Tarana Burke, who really has always been on the ground doing this work with Black and brown girls specifically, that she and when we're saying girls, we're talking about girls who've been impacted by sexual violence, been impacted by child sexual abuse, so that she's been doing that work. But in terms of what happened with the mass mediated response to it, it was completely focused on like celebrity culture, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that what's important is that we go back to those origins in terms of Tarana's work, and then so many other work, and that we are also inclusive of the voices of many, right? So that there's so many indigenous sisters and brothers and siblings, Asian, Latinx, like that we really branch out and really incorporate all those stories in different realities. Like, what does it mean to be sexually assaulted, to be molested as a child, and your parents are undocumented? So that's a different reality. Like, you're not going to the authorities. In terms of my anthology, Love with Accountability, one of the things that it's focusing on are the voices of 43 diasporic Black survivors who are trans, who are cis, who are queer, who are straight, who are Latinx, who are from the continent, who are from the African continent, from the Caribbean. And so to just have a wide range of different experiences under this umbrella, talking about not only their stories, but then how can we address it without solely relying upon the state?
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like what is powerful too about the origin story of Me Too is that it emerges from this Black feminist framework, right? And a lot of your work obviously emerges from this Black queer feminist framework too. What do you feel that framework has to offer the movement? I feel like we have so much to learn from Black feminists, from Latinx feminists, from women of color who have been sort of blazing these kinds of trails away from these traditional models of justice,
Right.
away from a carceral system and reporting to the authorities, and just sort of, focusing more on personal justice and community justice. How does that influence all of this creative work that you do in this space?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm 50 and I've been working for the past 25 years in this movement, and I see my work as a part of a continuum. I think about trailblazers like Loretta Ross and at the DC Rape Crisis Center, one of the oldest rape crisis centers in this country, and who've been talking about, we might not have named it as transformative justice or restorative justice in the way in which it is named, but that's the kind of work that we've been doing, fighting the carceral state as well as demanding gender justice in our communities. And so what I firmly believe is that for queer and women, regardless of their sexual orientation, and men of color, that we're on the margins. And so that when we center our voices and experiences, we're creating space for everyone.
Yeah. And what sort of reverberations have you seen? I mean, I feel like, the theme of this year's conference is Beyond the Breakthrough. And when I was reading about your work and learning about your work, I sort of thought, well, who better than Aishah to know what happens beyond the breakthrough, because you made this documentary and then all of these changes sort of unfolded in the way that folks were looking at and legislating around and reacting to rape culture. How do you think we leverage all of the stories being told right now for some sort of tangible progress? And what do you think that progress would look like?
Well, I mean, I think that for me, in terms of when I think about when I made No, the rape documentary, we need survivor leadership, but not, now let me be clear about when I say survivor leaders, because there's so many people who've been impacted. I'm thinking about survivor leaders who have an intersectional approach to addressing sexual violence, so that we cannot talk about sexual violence without talking about the carceral state, colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy. We cannot do that. And because if we do, then we are not addressing so many folks who are being impacted by this atrocity happening, and pandemic in many ways. So I think that in terms of Beyond the Breakthrough, it's like, for me, I think of breakthrough as like, we're talking about it. We're in a very mass mediated way. Like I remember when I was working on No in the 90s, no one wanted to talk about it. Yeah. Like it was very taboo. And it's not like everybody is running around wanting to talk about sexual violence, but that it's been in our national consciousness. And so I think that was the first breakthrough. But now we have to think about, what do we do now that we're talking about it? And I personally don't believe prisons are the solution, particularly when we think about people who are bystanders, and the reason why I'm saying this is, when we're thinking about bystanders, that there's so many more than those who actually commit the act. So we're only focusing on the person who committed the act. We're not dealing with all the systems in place that allow this act to happen. And so that prison, we can't lock up everybody. I don't believe in it, but even if we did, it's just impossible. Yeah. And so then we have to think about, what are ways that we can hold people accountable and change systems. And that's what I think Beyond the Breakthrough creates space for.
Yeah, and do you believe that storytelling in itself can be a form of justice for folks?
I absolutely believe in that. I absolutely believe in the power of transformative storytelling, because one of the things that I've learned through my work, which is why I do documentaries and anthologies, is collecting voices. And when I say collecting voices, so that people are telling their own stories. I'm not telling their stories. They're telling them stories, either on screen or through their written word. And that we have a wide diversity, because it's not a one size fits all at all. And so I wanted, like, for instance, there are people in my anthology who, they don't believe in prisons, but they're like, we have to work with what we have until we change something. And then there are people who are like, I'm a prison abolitionist. And for me, that was really important to have these pieces in conversation, because I'm not interested in speaking to the converted. I'm interested in, how do we all come together when we're all unanimous about needing to end this atrocity, but how do we do it? And hopefully humanely. And so storytelling creates an opportunity where we can hear different voices and envision new worlds.
Yeah, and what did some of those voices in the anthology sort of teach you? Like, did it change your framework or your perspective?
Yeah, well, one story that I just must lift up is that of my mother, who did she nor my father protected me when I said that I was being abused as a child by my grandfather. And for 37 years, nothing was done, you know. And so it wasn't up until a few years ago when she really came to grips with not only the harm that was done when the 10-year-old told her mother what was happening, but that I still engaged with my grandfather. Up until I saved his life in 2010, and then he subsequently died. And so for her to put herself out there and to talk about how, and she's a feminist, she's a survivor, she's an activist who is in the civil rights movement. My father was a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. That for her as a human rights activist, to not protect her daughter because of the important work that she was doing in the world, to put herself out there, I think create space for other parents to go, oh my God, is that my story? Am I parallel? And maybe I need to be, not maybe, I should be accountable to my child, even if my child is middle-aged like me. You know what I'm saying? So I think that is really powerful. There's a story of Monica Johnson Hustler and Tracy Wright of North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault. They talk about their mentoring, their mentorship. Monica mentored Tracy for years, and how that mentorship led to the creation of a youth advocacy institute that they have every summer in North Carolina. So Loretta Ross talks about intergenerational sexual violence in her family, and how the difference between a theory about addressing it and a lived practice.
That's so incredible and powerful. And what gaps do you think we still have in these conversations that we need to fill?
I think that we need to hear from more men. There are cisgender men in my anthology, but I wish that I would like to hear from more. Also from trans folks, gender folks, gender non-binary. My colleague in my fellowship, Amita Swadin, has this organization called Mirror Memoirs, which is specifically looking at the impact of sexual violence against queer, trans, and people of color, because they have the highest per capita rate of sexual violence. They are the most vulnerable. And so I think that, again, we have to think about this. So it's as a woman who's been, a cisgender woman who's been horrifically impacted by sexual violence, I also want to recognize that I'm not the most marginalized. And I think that that's also really important in our movements, because it's very easy to center our reality, regardless of the place in which we occupy in society. So I definitely experienced a lot of shit as a queer person, as a feminist, as a survivor, but I also know that I'm not struggling with some of the issues that my trans and gender non-binary siblings are experiencing, that my immigrant siblings are experiencing who don't have papers. So what is my work that I need to do to make sure that they're also at the table?
And I love that, because I feel like even that is a departure, right, from the sort of traditional narrative and framework that a lot of movements have had, of sort of still having that scarcity mindset of like, well, if I amplify your voice, then I'm not going to have a chance to get what I need to heal or to find justice for myself. So I love that. And that also makes me think too about this amazing conference that you're putting together to sort of bring voices together in real life. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, definitely. From No to Love, Black Feminist-Centered Forum on Disrupting Sexual Violence is a culmination of celebrating that this is the 25th anniversary of the making of No, and it's the release of the anthology. So for the first time ever, about 2/3 of the people featured in No, the rape documentary, will be in the room together. So that, and then the anthology overhead, so there are 43 contributors, about 23 contributors will be in the room. And so this will be an intergenerational, national, actually international. There are folks coming who've worked on No, who are in No from the Netherlands, from Italy, from France, who are going to be coming, and we're going to be talking about this in a global context, but through a Black feminist lens. And so I'm really excited about it. It will be held at the University of Pennsylvania, at the Annenberg School for Communication, at the African American History Museum in Philadelphia, and the Lightbox Film Center at the International House. So 3 venues. It will be free and open to the public. That was really important to me in terms of accessibility. There will be sign language interpreters. There are 2 deaf contributors in the anthology. Really, again, trying to embody the talk of including all of the voices and the most marginalized amongst the marginalized. So for more information, you can go to my website at with accountability.com, and then right there you can see the information about From No to Love. But I think it's going to be an amazing experience.
Oh, yeah, that sounds incredible. I'm already like, I want to go.
I will, yeah, come on.
Like, we'll be there.
Yeah.
And it, that also makes me think too about when I think about storytelling and Beyond the Breakthrough, and how all of these there's all of these things that need to get done, right, in the fight to end sexual violence. Like, we need to tell our stories. We need more survivors to feel like they can tell their stories, and we also need to sort of make sure that we do disrupt and that there are no more stories, right? And so how do you think we connect those two very seemingly different but yet so connected, like, missions of the movement, to sort of give space for stories, but then also say, but we don't want, like, these things can't happen anymore.
Exactly. And I think about my sister friend Walida in Mauricio, who talks about that we have to use speculative fiction. We have to envision something that doesn't even exist. So for instance, thinking about enslaved people, I can't even imagine folks in my ancestral line who one day were like, my people will be free, right? Maybe 1600. Here we are, 2019. I'm sitting here talking to you at this conference. And so I think we have to stop, and it's hard in this digital age of instantaneous. We've got to move beyond we're going to do the quick fixes, because I think it's the quick fixes that really mess us all up. We got to think long haul. I think about indigenous nations where the Iroquois Nation would make decisions that would impact for 7 generations. So I think that it is important to talk about disrupting and envision in this moment. And then while we're disrupting, thinking about what is it going to take so that I know I'm not a parent and I won't be one, but that the 2 generations from now, or maybe 1 generation from now, will not have to deal with this. I want to envision a world where there are people who are like, what people did that to each other? And so I think that we have to begin to really actually start doing visioning processes while we're also working to end it in this moment. So it's a both and.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say one thing, particularly because of Ms. It took me 11 years, of which 7 were full-time, to make the film No. And part of the reason was at that time in the 90s, no one was interested in funding a film on the rape and sexual violence in Black communities, intraracial rape. And it just took a very long time. It's very painful. And of course, everybody knows Gloria Steinem, but I didn't know her personally. But when I was near the end of trying to get across the finish line, when she heard from Kevin Powell that this young Black woman was making, young at the time, this film, that she immediately gave funding. And that funding played a pivotal role in my crossing the finish line. And so it's just really powerful in terms of being here with the Ms., background, and being interviewed by Ms. Magazine, having grown up with Ms. My mother owned, it was Ms. and Essence Magazine were part of my life from the set. And like I said, I'm 50, so we're talking about throughout, I grew up, my mother's a Black feminist. And so just in terms of just really wanting to lift up in terms of that intergenerational work with people like Gloria Steinem, Alice Walker, folks who were like, this film is important, and what can I do to make it happen?
Thank you so much. That's so incredible. I'm glad that we could find a time today to make this happen and sort of bring it a little full circle.
Yes.
And we'll continue that circle when I go to your conference.
Please come. Please, Carmen. Please.
And I'll put the link in the video bio so that all of you can go too. And yeah, thank you so much for all you're doing, for your powerful work, and for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, Ms., for just creating a feminist voice for generations throughout my life.
Yay, and it goes on.
All right.